Just to make the point, we're dealing with statements on a 2,000-page report, and something's gone on for a very long time. I know the Minister wishes to have the speech circulated. It just makes our job responding very, very difficult if we don't have the script.
The reports today. I haven't read the 3,000-page, but I know the Minister is under pressure today, and I don't wish to personalise.
Absolutely.
But on top of all the reports, not to have a copy of the speech today is unacceptable from the department.
Deputy, I can't. I'm told it's on its way. I'd have no problem waiting, but the problem is it could be 15 or 20 minutes. I don't know. I'm told by the clerk they don't know how long it will be. So.
It is here. Okay. It's just a matter of I can't categorically say that they're all photocopied at this point, but it is on its way. But I do apologise. It was remiss.
Can I make a suggestion for the run that we go ahead and allow the Minister speak, and then get it noted, and then get it circulated as soon as it gets here? Okay? Are we happy enough, Minister?
I do apologise. Gan buíochas leis an ceann comhairle as uchtán ama agus an deisio chuirtam. At the outset, I would also like to express my personal gratitude to the ceann comhairle, members of the opposition and of the House for the manner in which I have been facilitated today, so thank you all. The Farrelly Commission is a statutory commission of investigation established in 2017 to investigate the care and protection of Grace and others in a former foster home in the South East. The Commission is entirely independent of Government, the Minister and the Department in the performance of its functions. At the heart of the report is Grace, the pseudonym chosen to protect the identity and privacy of the young woman who lived with the foster family. We do not know her name, and that is as it should be. Grace was born in a hospital in the south of Ireland in 1978. Grace has an intellectual disability and is non-verbal, with a requirement for lifelong care. Grace is now 46 years of age. As an infant, Grace was given into the voluntary care of the state. Grace lived in a number of residential and foster settings within the then Eastern Health Board up to the age of 11. She was then placed in the foster care of a family by the South Eastern Health Board in February of 1989 in their home in the South East. The Farrelly Commission referred to this family as Family X, again to preserve Grace's right to privacy. The foster parents are referred to as Mr. X and Mrs. X. Mr. X was 67 years old when Grace came to live with the family in 1989, and the foster mother was 50 years of age. Grace would stay with this family for the next 20 years. Throughout her time with Family X, no social worker visited Grace's placement before 1995. Grace was not removed from the foster care family even when a complaint of sexual abuse was made to the Southern Eastern Health Board against Mr. X in 1996. The allegation was in relation to another individual who was no longer in the care of Family X. Mr. X died in the early 2000s. In 2007, a social worker warned that Grace was vulnerable to abuse and exploitation in the areas of sexual abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse and neglect. He did so after becoming aware of the previous allegation against Mr. X. Grace was eventually removed from Family X in 2009 and moved to a residential facility. For many years during her time with Family X, Grace did not attend any school. She was eventually brought to a day centre, but even then, her attendance could be irregular. By the year 2009, the Commission's report states that Grace's oral hygiene had been substantially neglected for some years to the extent that 7 of her teeth needed to be extracted as a result of gum disease. Grace lived with Family X into adulthood and until she was nearly 31 years of age. In July 2009, the HSE removed Grace from the care of her former foster mother and placed Grace in residential care. Grace was made ward of court in March 2010. The Office of the General Solicitor, as Grace's committee in wardship, and her legal team represented Grace's interests before the Commission. The Commission submitted 2 substantive interim reports on its investigation to the Department of Health, which were published on the 1st of October 2021. The Commission's findings on the extent to which Grace suffered any abuse are as follows. There is a finding of serious neglect on the part of Mrs X in relation to the lack of attention to Grace's dental care. There is a finding of neglect on the part of Mrs X in not ensuring that Grace attended the day centre more regularly and more consistently. The Commission is satisfied there was neglect in the standard of care provided by Mrs X to Grace, based on evidence given in relation to Grace's clothing and personal hygiene. The Commission states there was a level of financial mismanagement or abuse by Mrs X of Grace's disability allowance in breach of her duties as agent. The Commission tells us the evidence to it did not establish neglect of Grace in the provision of food and sustenance to her over the years she lived with family X. The Commission records it is not satisfied that the evidence was such as to establish that marks or bruises sustained by Grace was as a result of her having been subjected to physical abuse. The Commission states the evidence did not establish that Grace had been subjected to sexual abuse over the years that she lived with family X. Further, the Commission says it is not satisfied that evidence provided established or supported a finding that there had been emotional abuse of Grace. The Commission makes a number of findings in the final substantive report about decision-making in relation to Grace's care throughout the period July 2007 to March 2010. The Commission's report found that the general absence of oversight and monitoring of Grace in her placement by the South Eastern Health Board and the HSE inevitably permitted the areas of neglect established in the evidence to develop or persist over time, more or less unchecked. This was a fundamental failure of their duty of care to Grace in the circumstances. The Commission further highlights shortcomings by the South Eastern Health Board in the investigation of sexual abuse allegations made against family X and the lack of proper consideration to the position of Grace and her care in that context. The Commission of Investigation has gathered 312,000 pages of documentation over the course of 8 years, with the final report running to almost 2,000 pages. I remain of the view that an executive summary would have allowed greater accessibility to those impacted by the report and indeed the public at large. However, for the information of the House, the Commission's view is that it would have been impracticable to do so, having regard to the detailed factual background derived from the evidence contained in its 3 substantive reports, which collectively amount to around 2,800 pages. One of the Commission's terms of reference, known as Part X, relates to whether the facts and information gathered in the course of the inquiry warrants scope for any further work which the Commission could undertake in the public interest. This included 47 cases where other children had stayed with Mr. and Mrs. X in their home as part of fostering or respite arrangements. The Commission's statement on Part X conclusions indicates that there is an absence of information in the possession of the Commission identifying issues for further investigation. This is with respect to matters to do with the role or conduct of public authorities in respect of 7 cases identified, akin to the type of concerns raised in respect of Grace, save for 2 cases where the role of public authorities has already been investigated and reported upon by the Commission. The Commission states that there were no prosecutions recommended by An Garda Síochána or directed to be taken by the DPP in the case of any of the 47 people referenced in the statement on Part X. Following extensive consideration of these matters by the Department of Children in consultation with the Office of the Attorney-General, the Government has taken a decision that there is not a clear basis for moving forward to a Phase 2 of the Commission of Investigation. I would like to pay particular tribute to those who stepped forward and made protected disclosures relating to the handling of Grace's case. Their courage and persistence were instrumental in her finally being moved out of the foster home. I would also like to acknowledge the work of all of the members of the Dáil's Public Accounts Committee in highlighting and indeed pursuing Grace's case. I note Deputy Cullinan and Deputy Connolly were members of that committee, and I want to acknowledge your contribution I would also like to say a particular word of gratitude to the Chair at the time, John McGuinness TD, and former TD John Deasy, and I know there will be others in the Chamber today who were members of that committee and did such sterling work. I would like to say that the circumstances of Grace's case, which began in the 1980s, are heartbreaking, harrowing, and without doubt had a devastating impact on her quality of life. It goes without saying that what Grace experienced was both unconscionable and utterly unacceptable. I want to confirm that since this case came to light, significant changes have been made to help safeguard against circumstances like this ever occurring again. With respect to vulnerable children in the care of the state, the landscape concerning their treatment has radically changed. This includes the development of foster care standards, the creation of the Ombudsman for Children's Office, the establishment of HICWA, the establishment of TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, and the commencement of the Children First Act. From an adult safeguarding perspective, since these events occurred, the HSE has introduced a national policy for safeguarding vulnerable persons at risk of abuse, established a national safeguarding office and safeguarding protection teams, and most recently has undergone an independent review of its safeguarding policies and procedures, which has led to the appointment of a HSE Chief Social Worker for the first time. In addition, the Department of Health is currently developing an updated policy on adult safeguarding in the health and social care sector. Following the publication 2 weeks ago of the Commission's final substantive report, I intend to undertake an expert-driven, non-statutory safeguarding exercise. This will identify learnings from the Commission's findings to inform present-day safeguarding policies and practices. Officials in the Department are currently seeking to identify an appropriate expert in the field of safeguarding to carry out this exercise. The 7 people referenced in the Commission's statement on Part X and/or their representatives will be invited to participate in this exercise to share their lived experience if they so wish to do so. Safeguarding remains everybody's business. We must all work together, government departments, the HSE, TUSLA, all state agencies and the wider community, to be better and to do better, to ensure there is a focus on continually enhancing safeguarding across all services and indeed across society. I sent a notification to the Ward of Court to alert Grace's representatives that I would be publishing the final substantive report. I also inquired about Grace's general well-being. In response, the General Solicitor, as Committee of Grace, advised that they have arranged for regular reviews of Grace's care in a residential home by independent social workers. I met yesterday with the General Solicitor for Minors in Wards of Court, who confirmed that considered and extensive submissions were made on behalf of Grace to the Commission of Investigation. The General Solicitor also highlighted potential learnings for investigations in the future into issues involving people with disabilities. In that meeting, the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court indicated that Grace is extremely happy and is living a meaningful and fulfilled life, supported by a small team who are very, very committed to her well-being. For the information of the House, I also received correspondence yesterday afternoon from the Commission of Investigation, stating that it had fully discharged its obligations under Section 34 of the Commissions of Investigation Act 2004. This section outlines that before submitting the final or an interim report to the specified minister, a commission shall send a draft of the report or the relevant part of the draft report to any person who is identified in or identifiable from the draft report. It also stipulates that the draft report must be accompanied by a notice from the Commission specifying the time allowed for making submissions or requests. The Commission further confirmed its view that all steps were duly taken in considering submissions received, including those made on behalf of Grace. Is scéal ú fásach an méid a hála de Grace, ach tá annachchuid fáilme a gin ó héamh cosint daoine óga go háirithe daoine mí cumasach agus lóchheilech. Bíonn gá ann I gcónaí daoine mar seo a chosint agus ara le a chuairdóibh. Anis tá túsla, hicwa, an ombudsman de lenaí agus rialacha nua agus takeíochtaí ann chun an ara sin a choirí gríoch. Ach tá orin bheith fearach an tamar fad. Throughout this very dark and distressing episode, the one beacon of hope has been the confirmation that Grace is now living an extremely happy life, well cared for and well-minded. It is my fervent hope that what Grace endured during those terrible years will never be forgotten, and that she herself will continue to thrive and to triumph. Gur míle maith agaibh.
Thank you, Minister. Before we continue, I'd just like to point out that utterances in relation to the integrity of the chairperson of the Commission or utterances in relation to the professional competency of the chairperson of the Commission, we shouldn't be made, if that, to the members. Okay, so Sinn Féin, I believe you're splitting your time 25 minutes by 5.
So that means, Cathaoirleach, that I only have 5 minutes. So I will endeavour to raise some of the issues that need to be aired on the floor of this House in that time, and then we are sharing. I struggle to express just how astonishing and disappointing all of this is. The Minister said that Grace was at the heart of this process. That's simply not true. The rights, the experiences, the advocacy for Grace have all been, I believe, undermined by this process. 8 years, 7 extensions, 2,000 pages, almost 14 million euros, that process, and the fact that we are still left in the dark on the critical issues. The sum total of it is that the Commission makes a rather anemic finding of neglect. I mean, what I have heard of the Grace case spells out depravity to me, of a fundamental assault on the most basic human dignity of a person who could not speak for themselves. That's what it was. So to simply dust this off as dental neglect requiring extraction of teeth or minor instances of lapses in hygiene, I think insult Grace and do no real justice or reflection as to what actually happened here. Family X, Mr. and Mrs. X, were neglectful. There were very serious and credible allegations of abuse up to and including sexual abuse. The Commission has chosen to discount that. The Commission report pushes back against those very brave advocates, Minister, and the brave whistleblowers who came forward to tell the story. But take from the Commission that the family concerned, Family X, was neglectful. Of that there is no doubt. That is to vastly understate the case. But the greatest neglect and the greatest failure of Grace is actually the neglect and failure of the state and government itself. Neglect, or perhaps even complicity. I want to go back to 1995, 1996. Where the balloon goes up and the allegations are made and a decision is taken to remove Grace from the home in question. That decision is appealed by Family X. Their appeal fails. They then write to the Minister for Health of the time. And the Minister for Health acknowledges receipt of that correspondence and then extraordinarily responds a couple of months later to say, the decision was made, but there was then another appeal mechanism and the Health Board has reversed that decision. I, for one, want to know exactly what happened there. I want to know what was the dynamics of that. A decision that had been made, appealed, upheld, turned on its head. And a child returned to this hell, this depravity, and then left there until again another whistleblower comes forward. I don't believe that the Commission for 1 second has gotten under the bonnet of exactly what happened there. What it does acknowledge is that there was a political intervention. Would we go so far as to call it political interference? I don't know, Minister, and the Commission doesn't give us those answers, but we must get to those answers. The Commission also extraordinarily decides not to investigate the condition or the experiences of some 47 other children and young people. Extraordinary, even on their own terms, even on the basis of the anemic finding of neglect, to unilaterally make that call. What has government to say about that? Why has government accepted that? I don't believe that you should have. And then, Minister, there's the case of the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court, and you met with her yesterday. You see, Minister, in her statement, which to my recollection is unprecedented, I don't remember another case where the General Solicitor has come forward in this way. Correct me if I'm wrong. She not alone affirms that substantive and extensive submissions were made on behalf of Grace. The second part of what she says really matters. She says it was not acknowledged nor referred to in the Commission's report. So what on earth was that all about? This report is, to my mind, absolutely shocking. Shocking because it fails Grace again, but all the more shocking, Minister, because the world hasn't changed entirely. And all is not well in Ireland still to this day in terms of the safeguarding and well-being of vulnerable children in care. And this Commission report not alone does a disservice to Grace, but it does a fundamental disservice to the political, the social, the moral imperative for all of us to insist that vulnerable children and young people are protected, and when they are not, to demand accountability. Okay. This has been called a whitewash. I understand why that term has been used. It's utterly, utterly shocking, and I have no doubt these are matters that we will have to return to again.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Curran.
Look, Minister, just before I begin, I want to acknowledge the way you went about making the rearrangements for this morning. Thank you. Grace was 10 years old when she entered the foster care placement that is at the heart of the Commission report. It was due to be a temporary placement in 1989, and I don't think we can remind ourselves enough that she was a 10-year-old girl, she was a child, and she was without a voice. And the failure began before Grace even entered that house, and I would very much struggle to call it a home. She was placed there by the South Eastern Health Board. The house was never assessed and it was never formally recognised as a foster home. Why? Grace was not visited by a social worker for the first 6 years, for those formative years of any child's life. Why? It wasn't just Grace. There was 47 other children placed in this house. However, Grace remained there for 20 years, despite it to be temporary. Why? She remained there despite allegations of abuse on at least 2 occasions that we know of. Why? She remained there despite the Brothers of Charity stopping children going into that house in 1991. Why? In 1996, there was a decision made by the Health Board on foot of concerns of possible abuse, but that decision was later overturned. Why? It was not until 2009 that Grace was removed from the home. Why? None of these whys are known. This is a very lengthy report and it does not answer any of these questions. When the Commission was announced by then Taoiseach Enda Kenny, he said it will get the answers that the people need. That has not happened. What we do know is that Grace was failed over and over. What we do know is the very few people that spoke up for her were ignored over and over. And what we also know is throughout those 20 years, numerous people did not care about Grace. I want to commend the 2 whistleblowers that came forward, that cared enough to raise concerns about Grace and did so at huge cost to themselves. We've since heard from both of them. One said that the report was a waste of time. Grace's own legal team have said that their submissions, they were acting on behalf of Grace, they were her voice, are not included in any way in the report. And we've heard from the second whistleblower again this morning to say the same thing. His submissions to the Commission were not included in the final report. Minister, these failures are not in the past. They are not something that happened just in the 80s and 90s. Concerns have been raised repeatedly in relation to the care system that we have in Ireland today, and they have been raised repeatedly. Grace wasn't listened to. Those that cared for her weren't listened to. And we have to listen now. I have, and I will again say, the Children's Residential and Aftercare Voluntary Association have pointed to an increase in unregistered and uninspected for-profit providers in our care system. They have said the lives, safety and mental health of the most vulnerable children in the state are at severe risk. They have called repeatedly for an independent review of Ireland's care system, and I would ask that we do that. The Child Law Project last year told us the care system in Ireland is at breaking point. They've described judges in court as being in despair. We know they've also raised issues in terms of the fact that 250 children are left without a social worker. There are so many issues, and we need to review independently our care system. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge the many wonderful foster carers that we have in our country. We need more of them. The numbers of them are falling, and this is also a difficult read for them as well, and I want to acknowledge them. Thank you.
Deputy Gunnan.
First of all, can I welcome the fact that we have an opportunity to debate the Commission's findings. And if I can start by saying that I've spoken to a number of people who care for Grace, and an organisation who care for her over the last number of years, and her thoughts are in my mind today. I think from the conversations I've had, that Grace is now getting very good care. She's a lovely, beautiful person. And her thoughts obviously are in all of our minds today. The Minister is right. I sat on the Public Accounts Committee that examined this, as other members of this House have, and it was one of the most appalling cases I've ever come across. And I listened to the account of the whistleblowers who came before the Public Accounts Committee when I was a member and told of the harrowing experience of Grace in that foster home for 20 years. And I'll never forget hearing some of the really, really awful accounts coming from those whistleblowers. And they were people who came forward and for the first time not only blew the whistle, but were prepared to see it through to the end. And as we know, they were treated shamefully as well by the state and by those in authority. And I want to commend those brave whistleblowers for coming forward. And obviously, this was a deeply distressing case. But what was most distressing about it was that there were so many red flags missed over so long. This was the worst case of out of sight, out of mind that I have ever seen. That Grace was left in this foster home for 20 years. And as the Farrelly Commission has said, and you said in your statement, Minister, for years on end, there was no visits for many social care workers. She was literally left in that home despite very, very serious allegations being raised by other families in relation to Mr. X. And yet Grace was left in that home. And it wasn't just the Grace case. We've had since the Emily case. And again, Emily was a female who was brutally raped in a nursing home. Again, there was a report into that case. Again, it found shortcomings in relation to safeguarding. We had the Brandon case, which looked at 104 incidents and reported on 104 incidents of inappropriate sexual behaviour by a person in that care home, in that setting. Again, a report, again, recommendations. And at the core of all of it is safeguarding. When Grace was in that foster home, for 12 years of her life, she was an adult. If Grace was still there today, or any person in very similar circumstances, as we sit here, as we debate this report, they still do not have the legal protections of safeguarding. Safeguarding legislation still isn't in place, despite all of those reports, despite all that we have seen. That is still the case. We still don't have mandatory reporting in relation to allegations of abuse or neglect for adults in care settings. That is absolutely astounding. Mary Lou MacDonald and myself have met organisations that have been crying out for safeguarding legislation for years. Care Champions most recently, the Irish Association of Social Workers, experts. In fact, there was one safeguarding expert in relation to the Emily case who went public to say that there was an attempt by HSE officials to actually alter the case file in that situation. That's what was happening, and yet still nobody is held to account in any of those cases. Nobody in the HSE or elsewhere has been held to account for the failures in relation to Grace. And we cannot mince our words. And I want to finish on this, if I can, Minister, because we can't do justice to Grace in any 5-minute contribution that we have, but we have to acknowledge the failures. There was individual failures where red flags were raised, and I believe not only missed, but ignored by people who should have known better and people who should have done better. There were systemic problems across this case and many more cases where, again, institutional accountability has not been accepted. And there also has to be political accountability. And the political accountability has to be taken by government. And I think it's shameful as we debate this today, we're debating it still at a time when we don't have the most robust safeguarding of adults and protections for adults in care settings. And that, it has to be said, is on the Oireachtas and most especially on the government.
Thank you, Deputy Cronin.
8 years and €13 million later, we are still in the dark about what Grace endured. Shockingly, critical information and extensive submissions have been omitted from the 2,000-page report, according to the legal team responsible for the legal, personal and financial affairs of Grace. This raises huge questions about the report. That such vital information should be omitted from this report, it beggars belief, Minister. That Farrelly's report on Grace managed 2,000 pages, that's nearly a box of paper. You know how big that is. Yet no executive summary, it's apparent, and yet she managed this omission. Over 2,000 pages, fire hosing at its finest. That we even needed a Farrelly commission into the Grace case is a damning indictment of a system that abandoned a vulnerable, non-verbal young girl in the most appalling way imaginable. I'm a plain speaker, Minister, and this is a national disgrace. And I know that you know it too, Minister Foley, because I could see how uncomfortable you were on the day that this report was published. Grace was left in a foster home where allegations of sexual abuse and neglect had been raised repeatedly for 20 years. Grace was left in this foster home when other foster children had been removed. And yet the decision makers in this state, the cream of the crop, the ones who rise to the top under successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments, not only failed Grace, they actively looked away. Reports from social workers ignored. Whistleblowers were silenced. Bureaucratic indifference won, and basic human decency lost. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened under successive governments that put institutional reputation above the welfare of its citizens, in this case, a vulnerable, non-verbal child. We have scoliosis parents who have approved springs implanted in them by doctors at CHI. Hip dysplasia children seemingly operated on who didn't need operations, while other scoliosis children wait for an operation that they can't have. We have the cervical smear scandal where Vicky Phelan stood up to the might of the HSE, Emma Vic Nahuna from my own constituency in North Kildare. Bridget McCole and the hepatitis C scandal. 43 years the Stardust family were left waiting for an inquest and an apology. Thalidomide mother Peggy Murphy died last month without one. Scandal after scandal, lack of accountability after lack of accountability. But we shouldn't be surprised because the man backing up this arrogant government himself found guilty of corruption before the Moriarty Tribunal, and you continue to bend the knee to his will, all to cling to power. And if this government's power trip lasts another 4.5 years, as true as I'm standing here, we'll be here again with some other scandal. The Irish people deserve better, and Grace deserved better.
Deputy Murphy.
Guramayagat. Minister, this is not the first time we have been in here in relation to this state's abject and absolute failure of the most vulnerable in society. And we are after a report, and my colleagues and others have stated absolutely eloquently of how it has not done the business that it was required to do, and at a huge cost of €13.6 million. And what is the finding? An absence of oversight and monitoring of grace. Look, we know the reasons why this commission was engaged in the first place, and that was on the basis of there were allegations of brutal assault, physical, sexual, financial abuse, obviously huge abuse in relation to, and there's been mention in relation to what sometimes is put down as regular negligence. But even then, when we deal with the failures around oral hygiene, or we deal with that would be sufficient for this to be an absolute disgrace. But when we talk about the wide I suppose, level of abuse, it's incredibly difficult to listen to these particular issues. And in fairness, it's not subject matter I'm particularly comfortable dealing with in any way, shape or form. But I think it's absolutely necessary that we have this opportunity and that we get down to, unfortunately, the brass tacks of the absolute failure. And I suppose in speaking about this, at times we do forget about, and we need to make sure that everyone remembers, right, Grace. Grace was a young girl with obviously intellectual and physical disabilities. She was non-verbal, which put her in an incredibly vulnerable position. I can't even imagine what this was like for her, and the difficulty for members of her families and whatever that get constantly re-traumatized by dealing with this. But we as a state have to deal with this. I am very glad from what I hear from Deputy Cullinan and from yourself in relation to that Grace is now living what is a fulfilling life, and that is obviously what she deserves. Now, we need to go through the ins and outs of, as I say, the abject failures. We're talking also about a report that has been produced. We know the multiple complaints in relation to the lack of an executive summary. We know that at this stage we have multiple lawyers who are representing Grace. We have those who have never commented before in the state legal infrastructure. And we have whistleblowers who are saying this wasn't worth doing in this, you know what I mean? And that's on the basis of the result we have at this point in time. Now, the onus is on government to actually lift what is a continuation of failure and to deliver. And as Deputy Cullinan has stated, we have abject failure when we talk about the fact that we do not have the safeguarding legislation that is required. And many of us were at this week at an event with Care Champions, where they again reiterated where people and family members actually from the audience spoke about a huge level of the failures that they have encountered in relation to the lack of this safeguarding legislation. He also spoke about the absolute necessity in relation to mandatory reporting when we talk about those citizens within residential settings. Look, it's actually hard to comprehend how there are no findings from this report, and that there are no findings in relation to the failure by those that were employed by the state to look after, to care in any way, shape or form. And we look at Grace, who in around the age of 11 in 1989 was put in this house, because like my colleagues, it's very difficult to how you could call this a home. So she was placed there, and we hear that down to obviously numerous allegations, in 1991, a determination was made that no other children would be placed in this set of circumstances. No social worker visited Grace before 1995 in this placement. She was not removed from the foster care family when a complaint of sexual abuse was made to the South Eastern Health Board against Mr. X in 1996. 2007, a social worker warned again that Grace was vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, and she wasn't removed till 2009. There obviously any right-thinking person. There is no defence in any way, shape or form. But, Minister, it is where we go from here. It is ensuring that we do justice by grace, but beyond that, that we also make sure that we fill those gaps that exist at this point in time in relation to the protections for those most vulnerable. We are talking about both children and we are talking about adults. And while things have improved, they have not improved sufficiently. And we can't just address this in the way we address many other issues in relation to learnings. And the onus is on government. And look, many people have spoken about some of the many other failures in this state. And the Taoiseach has spoken recently about he doesn't necessarily see commissions of inquiry or investigation on the means of, providing justice and the answers that are required by the likes of those people who survived the abuse of Michael Shine. But it's up to government to find a framework on how we actually deliver upon these. Since I dealt with the issue in relation to CHI, I had a man who came in and spoke about how he had been placed in a hospital setting. He spoke about how the doctors have spoken to him about that they find it incredibly strange in relation to the operations that he has had that has impacted in relation to his life. He also spoke about what I will just term treatment, but everyone can imagine that happened within this setting. I will be looking for governmental engagement on official level in relation to that case. And also another man who spoke to me about historic abuse within a school setting. And I am talking physical and sexual. He brought it to the Gardaí. It has not moved on. But it is a case of he's not sure that even, let's say, the inquiry that is to occur in relation to sexual abuse in schools, whether that will relate to him. So I'm asking yourself, Minister, and your government colleagues that we could ensure there would be communication with these two cases, which I'll bring to you, and we make sure that that's delivered upon, while we also owe a duty to grace, and that there are no more future graces, and that we do not fail our most vulnerable, as we have done for far, far too long.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move to the Labour Party. Deputy Wall, you have a maximum of 15 minutes.
Minister, I too want to thank you for the way you went about making arrangements for this debate today, and also to offer my condolences to you and to your family. I welcome the opportunity today to speak on the Farrelly Commission report on behalf of the Labour Party. At the heart of this scandal was and is Grace and other vulnerable children, and how they were maliciously failed by the state and those employed to care for them. At the outset, I want to pay tribute to the brave whistleblowers Ian Smith and, of course, Paula, who made a protected disclosure in 2009 that brought this to light and fought to protect Grace. I also want to acknowledge John Deasy, John McGuinness, Daniel McConnell, Fergus Finlay, Colma Mungan, members of the PAC Committee, who campaigned with determination and compassion to bring this story to light. The fiasco of what happened during the Commission and the outcome of the report raises serious concerns for us as legislators and for the Government and state agencies. The profound lack of public accountability must be addressed. Having spent millions, so many of us are at a loss at the failure to vindicate the rights of Grace and set out clearly what happened to her, who was responsible and why it happened. I want to quote what the whistleblower Paula told RTE's Today with Claire Byrne show, which sums up the outcome. I think the HSE and the people named in the report who failed Grace must be absolutely delighted this week by the narrative and the spin that's been peddled in relation to that. I say people very deliberately here because it suits them for us to talk about system failures, but the system did not fail Grace. People working in our health service failed Grace. The Farrelly report has detailed individual and system failures that has led to a devastating traumatic impact on Grace. There was a clear gross neglect, a breach of Grace's basic human rights and dignity. The report highlights the cold and bureaucratic machine that many disabled people, their families and whistleblowers face, an uncaring system. If this is how the system operates, if this is how the state met its responsibilities, then we need a total reset. We need a new approach to care that is truly reflective of the rights of the disabled people, one that's based on the values of dignity, transparency and compassion. This isn't just a watershed moment because we've had these reports before. In 2023 we had the Emily case report, we have the ongoing Brandon case and now Grace. This isn't a watershed moment, it needs to be a tidal wave of reform. Without political will, the system reform tragedies like Grace's can and will happen again. The disabled community, their families and advocates need reassurance from government that they will prioritise adult safeguarding legislation. We are still waiting on the National Disability Strategy. The Protection of Liberty Safeguarding Bill and the Adult Safeguarding Bill haven't been given the urgency that is needed. We need to provide the legislation and mechanisms in which we can fully support people with disabilities and safeguard them against harm. There is to be no phase 2 to the Commission. This will be distressing to other families that have many questions unanswered. The risk of this was made clear by the Labour Party in 2017 when the Commission was established. The decision not to proceed with Part X raised serious questions about justice because the families concerned have known for some time their opportunities for truth and accountability would be hindered. Many of the witnesses that took part in the Commission found it to be adversarial, as if they themselves were on trial. 7 years ago, the Commission was granted a 12-month extension around the time it was due to submit its Phase 1 final report. In May 2018, Brendan Howland raised with the government in the Dáil concerns that had been expressed by victims' families of the highly confrontational and indeed adversarial nature of the Commission's work, as reported in the Irish Examiner. I want to quote from that article today, Minister. "We are shocked at how we have been attacked, accused almost of telling mistruths. This was not what we were expecting. It has been horrendous," said one. We highlighted then in the Chamber to the Government the concerns of the families of the victims of further delays in investigating their treatment. 7 years ago, the Government knew about the issues at the heart of this Commission, and it no doubt should have informed us that the Commission would not establish a finding that Grace was subject to physical, sexual or emotional abuse or neglect in the provision of food and sustenance. But it did make a finding of neglect in the standard of care provided, a lack of attention on dental care and financial mismanagement by Mrs X. I do not intend to go into the detail of these issues, but there should be no hiding from these problems with the Commission that they have known in some form for many years and further articulated publicly by others since the publication of the report about the lack of finding on these key issues. As Fergus Finlay highlighted in his article on Saturday the 19th of April in the Irish Examiner, we will never know why internal HSE reports raise serious anxiety about sexual abuse of Grace, but the Farrelly report dismissed that entirely, saying it found no evidence. The article by Mr Fergus Finlay also outlines what happened to a resident of Exfran and the experience of her mother Nuala when she was a witness to the Commission. I would urge everyone to read what he wrote. It spells out how survivors of abuse and their families have once again been let down by the State and the Commission. Minister, he concludes by asking who will apologise to all of them for what happened. The promise of a non-statutory safeguarding exercise must be delivered and will facilitate those families because they have been let down. The Government must provide the full details on this exercise and in the interest of transparency and to begin to rebuild trust with the people failed by the State and other agencies. This exercise needs to be fully independent of Government and an independent expert must be appointed. We must remember that it was the whistleblowers who fought tooth and nail to bring these failings to light and indeed to protect Grace. It was deeply depressing to hear Ian Smith detail on radio the toll it took on him emotionally, financially and indeed on his family. We need more whistleblowers, not less, and it's why Labour introduced legislation to protect them. If the perception is allowed to remain that the State will try to crush you speaking up, then I say to you, Minister, we need to seriously review the protections that are in place. And we must now question the suitability of Commission of Inquiries into safeguarding issues. Listening to the Irish Association of Social Workers, they have noted that this points to a process which cannot facilitate the necessary reflection and dialogue that is needed to ensure we understand what happened to Grace and how we can learn from it. An astonishing situation has occurred whereby the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court, Marie-Claire Butler, has issued a statement on the case, which is indeed very rare. The General Solicitor has clarified that while extensive legal submissions were made on behalf of Grace, these were not included or referred to in the report. This is extremely disappointing and most likely re-traumatising for Grace and the families involved. It would now be welcome if the Commission came before the Committee on Health or the Committee on Children to clarify why these legal submissions were not included or referenced, At a minimum, a public statement should be made. Failing that, serious consideration should be given to call by the Special Rapporteur on Child Protection for an inquiry into what happened at the inquiry, because we've heard the concerns of families and whistleblowers, and now also from Mrs Butler. This is also an extremely difficult report to read, not just in terms of its content, but also its accessibility. We have over 2,000 pages with no executive summary and no summary of the findings. Did the Commission at any point consider the disabled community in compiling this report? An easy-to-read version should have at least been provided, similar to those developed by Inclusion Ireland. It is so disappointing that we have a report on how the state and many others failed Grace, someone with a disability, and yet no one covered or considered how to communicate these failings to a person with a disability. This again further points to the need to reconsider our approach to dealing with safeguarding issues. The Commission has not delivered justice for Grace, and it has only pushed justice further away for her and all those families impacted. We in Labour are concerned at how long inquiries now take, not just the Farrelly Commission, but we've seen similar reports with those into NAMA and the IBRC, and the long walk to justice for the Stardust families. In our manifesto, we outlined a series of proposals to look at new approaches to provide adequate paths to truth, accountability and justice. If there is one positive outcome from this Commission, then it should be that reforms to develop a new model of inquiry with full disclosure and candour carried out in a non-adversarial way. I am calling on the Government to address the failure of the Commission model by firstly establishing an expert group to consider the current process we have, how to reform it and ensure a quicker path to justice for relatives and survivors. Secondly, we must develop legislation to allow for the appointment of a parliamentary inspector, as used in Australia, as an alternative to tribunals and commissions of inquiry for issues like those the IBRC Commission looked at. Finally, the Government should request the Law Reform Commission to consider the legislative framework governing statutory inquiries and tribunals tied into the proposed work of the expert group. Before I conclude, I want to recall the debate when the terms of reference for the Farrelly Commission were being agreed back in this House in 2017. My former colleague Brendan Howland stated that this shouldn't have been just an inquiry into the care provided to Grace. Rather, it should have been an inquiry into the care provided by the South Eastern Health Board and the care it provided by the use of placements with Family X, its monitoring of that care and its response to any concerns. Not just Grace, but the 47 other placements too. It should have been an X inquiry. Those eyewitnesses and their stories have been silenced by the decision not to pursue the next phase. This report does not provide justice for Grace, and the torturous delays mean the other cases will now not be addressed. After spending approximately $37 million in over a decade of reports and inquiries, no one has yet formally held accountable. What we had was cover-up and indeed secrecy, so often found at the heart of state failings, a desire to protect institutional reputation and avoid anyone being held accountable. I want to close by repeating what Brendan Howland stated in 2017. Reckless endangerment became a criminal offence in this state in 1997. Anyone who has even a cursory look at the reports on Grace would describe her situation as a truly perilous one, a case where she was left in danger due to recklessness. I would urge the Minister to refer all the reports on Grace and Family X now to Garda Síochána and the Director of Public Prosecutions. And I will call on the Government to pursue the programme of reform and inquiries that Labour have outlined this morning. We know this will happen again, and we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past if we don't improve the process of inquiries and ensure people impacted can secure truth, accountability and, most importantly, justice. Finally, I will call on the Commission to engage and address the concerns that have been articulated by whistleblowers, families and the concerns expressed by Grace's legal team.
Thank you, Deputy Wall. We now move back to the Government side. Deputy Guinness, you have a maximum time of 15 minutes.
I contributed to this previous debate on this issue, and we were addressing what exactly happened to Grace. And at the end of that debate, it was suggested that this House, as it represents the people, should insist on continuing to go back to the Grace case, to highlight the issues and to make sure that it was all dealt with. Since then, we've had various reports. We've had this report, and I have to say that I am shocked by the manner in which the report has been presented, by the language in the report, by the fact that you can hardly understand various parts of it. I am familiar with it, but in the course of reading the Farrelly Commission report, it is hard to piece it all together. And it is hard to believe that it has cost the state that much money. Now, I've heard senior government members say how bad the investigations are. It's hard to get what you want out of them, and so on and so on. In other words, that they're not fit for purpose, really. But yet, they were in government for more than one occasion. They had the opportunity to put in place an investigation, a commission of sorts, that would get to the truth, that would not cost this much money. And yet, what we're doing now is referring to the cost as if, and to the terms of reference, as if we should no longer do commissions of reports like this. It's incumbent on the government to establish the best practice for the future. But right now, we have this case. The question for this Dáil is, are we going to allow this report to sit? Are we going to walk out of this chamber and say, well, we've heard from everyone now, that's it? I don't think we should do that. We should pressurise the government to ensure that this case is fully dealt with. And I go back to the original terms of reference when they came before this House and presented by Finian McGrath. It was stated that they would only investigate Grace. And with the help of Brendan Howlin and others, it was impressed on the Minister that that was not good enough, and he had to withdraw those terms of reference, and he had to go away and include the 47 others. Now we're back to the same position again. Here's the Grace case, and forget the 47 others. I will not forget them. I will not forget them. And I will remind this House that as members representing people and this country, and the responsibility that should be shown by health services and so on, we should not forget them. Now, you may say that that's this, because I've heard it said, so many changes have taken place, this could never happen again. Well, ask Mrs. Jones about that, who has had an experience with Tusla that would shock you, where her and her husband lost their house because of an accusation of sexual abuse made against one of their children. Untrue, it was found. I raised it here in the Dáil Minister with previous ministers. I was given replies, we look into that, send me on the stuff, the paperwork, which I did. Not one single reply, not even a phone call did I get to say they're going to look after the Jones family. And there it is in another email, please don't forget me. The other case, and I want you, Minister, to understand that the Jones family would love to meet you to discuss what's happening today, not 30 years ago, but right now, today. I have another case where a child being cared for by Tusla is being exposed to abuse, allegedly, when he visits his father. Reported to Tusla, and Tusla refused to discuss it with the mother. That's today. Today, that's happening. What are you going to do about those two cases? To go back to Grace, we may have paid millions for this Farrelly report, but there was lots of reports there before this. But more importantly, there is the protected disclosure made by the whistleblower. So it wasn't the HSE that found out about this case of Grace and this foster home. It actually came up in the Public Accounts Committee under a procurement question, or a question on procurement, where we discovered that people that did work in the HSE were now set up privately and were giving reports on various issues paid for by the HSE to the HSE about issues that they were familiar with when they were in the HSE. You couldn't make it up. They're named in the context of the Farrelly Commission, and they're still employed, some of them, in Tusla. Now, if we're serious about safeguarding children, those facts have to be investigated. You cannot tell me that you're going to give it to somebody else to look at. That would be a disgraceful thing to do. It would be a shoddy thing to do. And it would be another effort to push the facts under the carpet. This home was not recognised as a home. It took children from the HSE, from the Brothers of Charity. It had private people coming in. The reports tell you how many in each year were in that house. The reports tell you in a factual way, how the house was constructed, where these people lived, outhouses. One child was kept under the stairs and was sexually abused. Another woman described how her daughter was sexually abused. And she describes it like this. She would take off her clothes. She would put herself into a position which was a sexualized position, and that could not have been done by a non-verbal, emotionally and mentally challenged person. And he felt that in that woman, implements had been inserted in her, and that was part of the sexual abuse. The same description was given by Grace, or by Grace's representative. Turn up at a day centre, filthy, doubly incontinent, destroyed, having to be washed and cleaned by the centre, putting herself, undressing, putting herself into a sexualised position that she would have never have known about, lying down with her legs apart. Are you going to ignore all of that? It's not me saying it. It's there in the various reports by whistleblowers and by the staff within the HSE. You can't walk away from this. The senior person involved, social worker, but senior in terms of in administration as well, was never shown this file. He didn't know that Grace existed. It was kept from him. The file was kept elsewhere, and he did not know. It was a cover-up from start to finish. And every report since then has been a cover-up and a whitewash. And I don't say that lightly, Cahirdach. I don't say that lightly. And I got a text this morning from another woman who said, please don't let them forget my daughter. And I noted in the note, handwritten notes by the way, of every single meeting with the HSE. And I noted in it where the HSE's first reaction was, my God, this will destroy the corporate image of the HSE. We will have to stop it in its tracks. It's written in the various reports that I found. That is true. So are we going to leave that too and walk away from it? Are we going to allow those within the HSE at the time who knew everything about Grace, are we going to allow them to walk away, do nothing? Front page papers scream headlines of corruption, of abuse, and so on. So tell me this, financial abuse, dealt with curtly in terms of the report, glossed it over. Not one single penny did Grace have when she finished in that home. She had no bank account. None. That's fraud in terms of the social welfare payments and where the money went. But we're not going to look at that, according to the Farrelly Commission. We then go to sexual abuse. Bruised breasts, thighs, black eyes, and God knows what else. And an accusation that she was sexually abused and implements were inserted into her. Now, does that not cause you to be concerned that it's not just one case, it's other cases, and it's men and women. Young men and women. Non-verbal men and women. And we're just going to leave it go. So, yes, there is a case there for sexual abuse. The guards thought so. They sent 5 files to the DPP. Then we have, I did the financial abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. When a child turns up in a daycare centre and doubly incontinent, destroyed, nose filthy, hair unkempt, eating all round her, her food, everybody else's food. That's contained in their reports. Does that not ring alarm bells? Did the Commission not see that? Did it not understand it? Now, in the course of the Commission's report, I couldn't read it all, but I did read some of the transcript. And I saw where, as I said, the most senior person at the time did not know anything about Grace. Another person sent in a not a protected disclosure, a submission to the Commission, delivered it by hand to the HSE in Lacken. And the Commission contacted him sometime later and said, have you nothing to say? But he said, I gave in a submission. I typed it up myself, I went through everything in detail, and I got it signed for it. The Commission didn't have it. The Commission didn't have it. And it's a similar thing all the way along through it. You can go back to the Public Accounts Committee and what happened thereafter. But the whistleblowers will tell you that in spite of all of the correspondence that they entered into, the key correspondence was never replied to, it was never acknowledged. That's why the greatest reports that are there to help are the reports that were written up by the social workers. They mustn't have been read by the Commission. They'd make a stone cry, so they would. And this was the social workers telling us this. Then we had in the transcripts again from the Commission, when an official from the HSE was being cross-examined on how they would approach things legally, it was put to that person that what he had been describing was actually legal subterfuge. And he was asked twice in cross-examination, do you mind if I describe it like that? Is that the way the HSE would work? Is that what you mean by it? Ah, yeah, he said, you can call it that. As casual as you like. Probably knowing full well he was going to get away with it. In that Commission, the HSE was armed to the teeth with lawyers of one kind and another. They cross-examined in a brutal way some of the witnesses. In a brutal way. And when a witness wished then to cross-examine someone else, they had to do it themselves. No legal protection, no legal representation. So there's so much wrong with this report, and Minister, so much wrong with what the government is suggesting, that we now give it to somebody else. Dogs will bark and the caravan will move on. I hope to God that there's enough people in this House, across all of the political parties, that will put down some sort of motion to bring the spotlight back on the HSE, the South Eastern Health Board, and insist that they be asked to come before us. And by the way, Chairman, in conclusion, I believe that the Farrelly Commission and others should be brought before a committee of this House so that the content of these reports can be teased out.
Thank you, Deputy.
It cannot be let go.
Okay, thank you. I now move back to the Sinn Féin bench. I have no speaker. Is it yourself, Deputy MacDonald? 5 minutes? No. It's not. Okay, Social Democrats, it has. Okay. We'll go to 15 minutes. Maximum. Deputy Quaid.
Yep. Thank you, Minister, for your statements on the Farrelly Commission reports. The Taoiseach took exception yesterday to my raising the need for an urgent meeting of the Oireachtas Disability Matters Committee with yourself and Senior Counsel Farrelly on the inquiry and the report, and he warned against politicising the issue, and he emphasised your independence from the Commission, and I fully accept that independence. But there is an urgent need to take political responsibility for what happens next, and there are legitimate and serious and consequential questions to be asked of you in that respect. The Disability Matters Committee needs to explore how evidence from Grace's legal representative can be given expression and incorporated into the findings of the inquiry. And it was really shocking to hear earlier this week that it was not referred to anywhere in the report or incorporated. We need a clear timeline on the introduction of adult safeguarding legislation by the Department of Health, and I'm sure that your department will need to work closely with Minister Carol McNeill on that, given the particular vulnerabilities of disabled people to abuse and neglect and exploitation. And I've seen, from my own experience working in the mental health services, I've seen firsthand the vulnerability of people with an intellectual disability in those circumstances without that legislative framework to protect them. The Irish Association of Social Workers and other agencies have been calling for this legislation for many years. In the absence of mandatory reporting, vulnerable adults are more at risk of abuse and neglect and exploitation. Crucially, we also need to know what plans you and Minister Carol McNeill have to hold accountable HSE managers who allow harm to occur to vulnerable people in their care. Grace is part of a tragic series of failings along with the Brandon and Emily cases by the HSE, where lack of accountability is at the heart of the wrongdoing. In the case of Brandon, multiple disabled residents of a HSE-run facility in County Donegal suffered serial abuse for over a decade at least in the full knowledge of management. In the case of Emily, HSE managers attempted to obstruct an initial review into the possible abuse of nursing home residents in light of the conviction of a care assistant for the rape of Emily. Grace was left in a foster placement for many years where she suffered chronic neglect and was at clear risk of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. So there has to be accountability for HSE managers. We need to see a legislative framework, a clear timeline for that, for the protection of vulnerable adults. And we need to see the full evidence that has been shared by Grace's legal representative. Thank you, Minister.
And I first want to share, I just really want to express my thoughts and concerns for Grace, for her family, for all victims in this country of state wrongdoing, and victims who have been further bruised by the failure of the state in facilitating their access to justice. And the key points that I want to raise today are those flaws in our framework for accessing justice in terms of commissions of investigation, tribunals and inquiry. I want to really reassure or to just speak out to those people who are concerned right now, whose loved ones are in care in various ways across the state, and the reassurance that they must be seeking at this difficult time. And the improvements that we need to see in safeguarding for adults in particular, but overall, because we have seen some improvements, but particularly around transparency and accountability. Grace is a victim of state wrongdoing, and she has not been facilitated in terms of access to justice by the state, and the process of investigating what has happened to her is flawed. And I want to speak specifically today about the Commissions of Investigation Act of 2004, because it was brought in to address the shortcomings that we have seen previously in tribunals and inquiries and it has in some part proved helpful in the establishment of such tribunals, inquiries and commissions of investigation, which have at times reached the human rights standards that we would expect of those investigations. But sadly, more often, it has not. And I know that there is concern and reticence about reopening such a key piece of legislation that ultimately does have the potential to fulfil our needs in terms of human rights compliance. But I think at this stage, when we see the length, the delay, the cost and the shortcomings of what are emerging from this legislation, we have to look at it again. We have to question, why is it not meeting the needs of people who have been wronged by the state and in the state in seeking and accessing justice to those wrongdoings? It is not good enough. And that Commission of Investigation Act of 2004 is absolutely crucial within this. The idea that we are calling this week, we have experts calling for essentially an inquiry into the inquiry, that tells us that this legislation is flawed and it needs to be revisited, and it must be revisited if we are ever to expect to deal with legacy issues, with past issues, with the wrongdoings that so many people in this state, so many vulnerable people have been dealing with for their whole lives. And in my work in the human rights and equality space, I have met so many people who have become experts in human rights and equality because of the failings of this state to meet their needs in accessing justice. They have literally gone and got master's and PhD qualifications so that they can fight for their own cause in multiple judicial settings in this state to access justice, and this isn't happening. And yet we are continuing to establish commissions of investigation, to establish inquiries, to establish tribunals, which again and again and again, despite the fact that within the legislation they have the facility and the parameters to set terms and conditions which will meet those needs, again and again they are failing. And they are failing the most vulnerable people within this state. So we have to look at that, and we have to ask how we can better set a foundation for the establishments of these investigations which will actually meet people's needs and which will reach justice for those who have been wronged. And one of the reasons and one of the things that I think is so upsetting within this context is because it doesn't just affect those people who have been wronged, but it affects all of those people who are in facilities and settings across our state where there is a power imbalance, where they are vulnerable in the dynamic that they are in, and the state is the one that holds that greater power in those instances. And all of those people who are in those settings, and all of their families and loved ones who support them in their settings, who want to be reassured that they are safe in those settings, all of those people are impacted by what's happened in the last couple of weeks, in the publication of this report, in the statement from the chief solicitor, from the state solicitor since then. So we need to reassure those people that we are serious about finding justice and about establishing a framework for finding justice which actually works and meets those needs. There's no question that safeguarding has improved since Grace's case. There's no question that the HSE have continued to work to address some of these shortcomings, that the state has, that successive governments, in fairness, have done what they can in some instances to try and address those shortcomings. I do not deny that safeguarding has improved, but it is not where we need it to be. And certainly when it comes to transparency and accountability, it is nowhere where we need it to be. So I really just wish to urge government to be serious about dealing with this in a way that really reaches right down into those foundations, right down into those roots of legislation and frameworks which can actually build systems which then provide the justice that people seek in these instances. Thank you very much.
We move back to government. Deputy O'Connell, just to say we have just 10 minutes left before, so you have 15 minutes, so you can use your other 5 minutes when the debate starts again, okay? So
I appreciate the clarity on that, Chair. And first I want to thank the Minister for giving us time to have this debate today on what is a very important issue. And I also just want to offer my sympathies to you as well. On the publication of the Grace report, I began to read the nearly 2,000-page document, and I, like many others, found it difficult and upsetting to read the details of Grace's life. And as the discourse began around the report, I was also interested to find that others were also upset, not just by the investigation findings, which were distressing themselves, but by the report itself, its structure and format, and how challenging it was to follow. I had many people in my Dublin-Rathdown constituency approach me in advance of the publication of this report and afterwards, raising these very issues. And as many deputies have already said today, the report raises more questions than it actually answers. And my question really is, if the report's findings were so restrained, what was the reasoning for its publication being delayed 9 times? How, after nearly a decade of investigation, more than 300,000 documents, is the reasoning for overturning, for example, Grace's removal from the foster home in '96 still unknown, as has been raised by many other deputies here today? Even further, the revelation this week of the High Court's General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of court's public statements, it generates more frustration at a report which is now clearly inadequate. I do welcome that the Government has acted quickly and that the Minister will be meeting the General Solicitor to discuss the problems that she has raised. And I welcome the Government's decision, which is the right decision, not to begin the planned phase 2 of the investigation at this time. As investigating the incident surrounding one child at this time incurred costs of more than 13 million with unresolved questions, investigating incidents for a further 36 in the same format could only incur exponential costs with, unfortunately, no guaranteed results. Now, this does not mean that justice should end here. It is clear to me and to every other deputy in this House that more must be done. We need to find alternative ways of doing things, a way of investigating in a timely way that delivers results, recommended actions efficiently. The Commission's Investigation Act, in particular sections 22 and 24, states the process and requirements for incurring and recovering legal expenses, and this clearly requires review, particularly the appropriateness of a single-member commission who can issue written directions to the Minister to pay legal fees. And these commissions of investigations were introduced as a less expensive and quicker alternative to the tribunal's inquiries, a description that I think many of us will find difficult to justify for this particular commission. So now is the time for greater oversight in the establishment, the terms of reference and the financial implications of these investigations. It is so very important that we protect those who have suffered injustices. We also need to establish the right conditions to encourage those who want to do right, who want to come forward, to feel safe to do so and to believe that they will be heard and it will be worthwhile. As somebody who's researched and written about whistleblowers, I am very passionate about this particular point. The general dissatisfaction with this commission will do nothing to encourage people, unfortunately, to come forward again. These are the type of things that discourage people from stepping forward. So we need to create the conditions that will make those with information willing to step forward and to speak out about the injustice that they see. I want to take this opportunity to second the Taoiseach's statements earlier this week that we need new institutions and a new way to do investigations efficiently, effectively and in good time so that we can properly address issues in the future. Thank you.
I came in specially to listen. I didn't think my turn would come up today. I want to thank you for your contribution and for your dedication in relation to this, and also the chairperson that took over after you, Deputy Fleming. I want to thank the whistleblowers. And I'm here today, Minister, and thank you for the way you went around rearranging this. But just let me say, in your opening speech, you said, at the heart of the report is grace. Well, I can't think of anything more inaccurate than that, because certainly grace is not at the heart of this report. That's the first thing. And in preparation for this, and thinking I was speaking next week, I went back over, Chairperson, the Las Cancorla, all the reports that you're very familiar with, the Divine report, the Dignum report, the Resilience report, with the personnel that previously worked for the Health Executive, as you've already pointed out, and then a company was formed, and then they investigate themselves. The Divine report and the Dignum report, all of which were delayed in their publication, none of which is outlined anywhere as to why they were delayed. Reasons were given because of Garda investigations. That wasn't confirmed at all in any of what I read. And then we have the brave social workers. And not alone have we a pseudonym for Grace, we now have a pseudonym for the whistleblowers as well. Such is the state of fear, horror and regret that this whole thing has engendered, and we have the whistleblowers coming forward telling us that really they'd never do it again. They have lost so much, and these are all very serious issues. We have an inane comments from the Taoiseach talking about these type of inquiries we must inquire into. Certainly I agree with the reservations, but that's not the issue. The issue at the moment is, how have we got to this point? And let me just read out the High Court, please. I don't usually refer to my phone, but this is when the settlement was reached of 3.6 million. And we had Peter Justice Kelly, who put a face on this woman, Grace, as the Las Concorla has done. As well as outlining the facts which have already been outlined, he said, "It remains a mystery why the decision to remove her being Grace, against which the foster family made representations to the Minister for Health, was not acted upon." Remember now, the foster parents made representations to the Minister for Health, and I might get a chance to come back to that. "It remains a mystery why they were not acted upon and was later reversed by a 3-person Health Board committee." And of course, Chairperson, you might remember there was a lot of interplay on 2 Public Accounts Committee as to who exactly this panel was and who these people were and whether they still worked for the Health Executive or not. And we were told they didn't, and then subsequently found out that they did, and so on. Justice Peter Kelly, were it not that a commission of investigation had been set up, he would have insisted on answers to many questions, including what extraordinary hold the foster family had over the Health Board committee, which led to Grace being left with the family in the teeth of professional and social work advice. And then he hoped, Las Concorla, that the commission would get to the bottom of this. So, had the commission not been set up, Judge Peter Kelly would probably have done a better job in getting to the reasons as to why he felt he could rule a settlement of 3.6 million for Grace. And we have a commission that tells us what we already know, that the standard of general care was not up to standard, that Grace's hygiene wasn't up to standard, that her dental, she had 7 teeth removed. And we need a commission to tell us that, when that had been clearly outlined, Minister, in all of the reports, whatever their deficits, all of that had been outlined. However, it had been outlined more acutely by the whistleblowers, which was utterly ignored. And then the major finding that there was an absence of oversight and monitoring. These are what I would say the positive findings of fact that we already knew from the social workers, from the reports that were hidden and subsequently came to life, from the information that was extracted over and over, and if you forgive me in my bad imagery, extracting teeth, particularly in the context of Grace, and 7 teeth. And then the finding that there was no evidence of sexual or emotional abuse. Now, I have no understanding what the person in charge of the commission understands by the word emotional abuse. If that doesn't cover what she actually found herself, it's an extraordinary conclusion. I don't think we're ready to decide where we go from this commission. I think the horror of what has happened to Grace and the other people who were in that home that have been ignored completely, 47. I don't think we can make decisions here today. I think it's our duty here today to look at what has happened, to analyse what this report has found and how could they come to that decision. And then, Minister, you talk about meeting with, and I welcome that, with the solicitor in relation to her unprecedented statements. And you confirm. I met yesterday with the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court, who confirmed that considered and extensive submissions were made on behalf of Grace to the Commission of Investigation. Now, that in itself is extraordinary, and I think that, and I commend you for meeting with her. And that's an extraordinary and unprecedented. And then you utterly fail to tell us what that woman said, or how it was conveyed, or what led her to make those unprecedented statements. What led her to do that? And you go on to use, the General Solicitor also highlighted potential learnings. What were those learnings? What was outlined to you that led to that unprecedented statement? I don't like the word learnings. I actually don't like it at all. I'm not going to use it. What was outlined to you? Perhaps you could tell us that. And in what manner was it outlined to you? At what stage did it come to her attention that her submissions were not included in the report? was a draft report sent to people for their approval. I'm not sure what time I've left, Lascan Corla.
Deputy, but we'll come back in again, I think,
That's
next
okay.
week.
Am I finished?
So if you propose the adjournment, then we can resume at your time when it comes back in next week.
I move the adjournment.
Gurmagh.
Falcher.